"This house smells like you're dying, Dad." He said it standing in my own front hallway, coat still on, like he'd decided the smell was reason enough not to stay long. "This house smells like you're dying, Dad." My successful son visited twice in 4 months and made sure I knew exactly how the visit felt for him each time. My failure daughter moved a cot into my bedroom and never once in 4 months let me see her flinch. I'm 74 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. This isn't a story about a smell, or even really about dying. It's a story about which one of your children can sit with you in the hardest room of your life without needing to announce how uncomfortable it makes them. Let me back up. I live outside Omaha, Nebraska, in a small ranch house I bought in 1979, with money I made playing session guitar on records most people have long since forgotten existed. I was never famous, not really, but I was good, good enough that for about a decade I made a living out of other people's songs, laying down parts in studios from Omaha to Nashville, my name buried in liner notes nobody reads anymore. I married my wife Joanne in 1974, raised 2 kids in this house, and when the session work dried up in the 80s the way it dried up for a lot of guys like me, I took a job managing inventory at a hardware distributor and never played much of anything again, except sometimes, late at night, alone, when the house was quiet enough that I could still hear what I used to sound like. I remember those studio years the way you remember something that felt, at the time, like the beginning of a much bigger life than the one I ended up living. 12-hour sessions in rooms that smelled like cigarettes and coffee, producers who barely remembered my name calling me back anyway, because I could nail a part in 2 takes when other guys needed 6. I met Joanne at a small club in Lincoln where a friend's band was playing. And I remember thinking, the moment I saw her laughing at something across that crowded room, that whatever else happened with the music, I'd found the one thing in my life I was never going to let slip away from me the way everything else eventually seemed to. I want to tell you what one particular session actually felt like, not the shorthand version I usually give when somebody asks about those years, but the real texture of it, because I think it matters for understanding what Casey was actually holding in her hands when she carried that box down from the attic. It was late 1978, a session in a studio just off Music Row, working on a track for an artist whose name never quite broke through the way everybody. We'd been at it since early afternoon, take after take of a bridge section that wasn't landing right, the producer growing quieter and more frustrated with each pass, until somewhere around midnight, exhausted in the particular way that strips away everything except pure instinct, I found a voicing on the guitar that finally locked the whole arrangement into place. I remember the engineer looking up from the board, the producer actually standing up out of his chair, and for maybe 4 seconds before anybody said a word, the whole room just sat there in the kind of silence that only happens when everybody in it knows, simultaneously, that something real just happened. That's the feeling 6 miles from anywhere came out of, a few months later, written alone in this house at my own kitchen table after Joanne had gone to bed, chasing that same specific feeling of a voicing finally locking into place, except this time with words instead of just chords, about a stretch of Nebraska highway I used to drive on tour, 6 miles from anywhere that mattered, going somewhere I couldn't yet name. I finished it in a single sitting, 4 in the morning, and I remember waking Joanne up just to play it for her, too excited to wait for a reasonable hour, and I remember her sitting up in bed, listening to the whole thing without a word, and then telling me quietly that it was the best thing I'd ever written. I believed her completely. I still do. Bradley came along in 1979, the same year I bought this house, and Casey followed 4 years later, And I want to be honest with you. The music mostly stopped being a real career somewhere in that stretch. Not because I stopped loving it, but because session work in Omaha wasn't what it had been. And a man with 2 kids and a mortgage doesn't get to keep chasing a fading dream past a certain point without it costing his family something. I took the hardware distributor job the year Casey turned 3, and I want you to understand, I never once resented that decision, not really. I resented, sometimes quietly, how completely that old life disappeared, how a man could spend a decade of his youth doing something he was genuinely gifted at and then simply stop and have almost nobody left in his adult life who ever knew that version of him existed at all. Joanne knew. She kept every reel of tape, every contract, every notebook, packed carefully into that attic box over the years, told me more than once that someday I'd want to go through it all again, remind myself what I'd actually built before life asked something more practical of me. I never did, not while she was alive, always meaning to get around to it eventually, the way you mean to get around to a lot of things when you assume there's still plenty of time left for them. Joanne passed 6 years ago, and I've lived in this house alone since, right up until 4 months ago, when a cardiologist named Dr. Anand sat across from me with a folder full of scans, and told me, gently but plainly, that my heart was failing in a way that wasn't going to reverse itself, that we were talking about congestive heart failure, advanced enough that the conversation now was less about cure and more about how to manage the time I had left with whatever dignity we could manage to hold on to. Welcome to Brian's revenge. If that opening's already sitting heavy in your chest, that's exactly where I hit that like button. Tell me where you're watching from and stay with me. Because what happened in the months after that diagnosis is going to show you exactly which one of my children actually understood what it means to show up. My son Bradley is 46, does well for himself in regional sales for a medical device company. Ironically enough, the kind of job where he spends his working hours talking compassionately to hospital administrators about patient dignity, and then drives 4 hours to visit his own dying father twice in 4 months. My daughter Casey is 41, cuts hair at a salon off Dodge Street, the kind of work Bradley's wife Denise once described, at a Christmas dinner I still think about, as something Casey does while she figures out what she actually wants to do with her life, said with a little laugh that made clear she considered the question mostly settled already, and not in Casey's favor. The house started to smell different about 3 weeks into my decline, the particular smell of medical equipment, and the ointments the home health nurse used on my legs where the fluid retention had gotten bad. And beneath that, underneath everything, the smell that I think Bradley meant, the smell of a body starting to fail in a house that used to smell like coffee and cut grass and Joanne's cooking. I noticed it myself some mornings before I'd fully accepted what it meant. I understood, by the time Bradley said what he said, exactly what he was reacting to. I just hadn't expected my own son to say it out loud, standing in my hallway with his coat still buttoned, like a man announcing he'd smelled something unpleasant in a restaurant rather than standing in his dying father's home. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments which one of my children you think actually sat with me in the hardest room of my life, because I promise you, it wasn't the one with the medical device sales job. Bradley's visit that day lasted 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my own nightstand the whole time, the way you watch a clock when you're trying very hard not to notice how little of somebody's patience you're actually receiving. He stood near the doorway of my bedroom, didn't sit, mentioned something about a client dinner he needed to get back for, and on his way out, pulling his coat tighter like the house itself had chilled him, he said it, not cruelly exactly, more like an observation he didn't think twice about making out loud. "This house smells like your dying dad. Have you thought about hospice, somewhere that's actually equipped for this. I've thought about a great many things, Bradley, I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. I hadn't thought until just now about how it would feel to hear my own son say that to my face. He didn't apologize. I don't think he understood, even in that moment, that there was anything to apologize for. He just nodded, said he'd call to check in, and left. And I lay there in my bed a long while after his car pulled out of the driveway, thinking about 11 minutes, and about a smell I couldn't do anything to change, and about a son who'd apparently decided that his own discomfort in that room mattered more than whatever comfort his presence might have offered me. Casey moved in 3 days later without me asking her to, showing up with a duffel bag and a folding cot she set up right beside my bed, said she wasn't going anywhere until we figured out together what the next stretch of this was actually going to look like. I want you to sit with the contrast there, because it matters for everything that comes after. My son stood in a doorway with his coat on, timing his own visit against a dinner reservation. My daughter set up a cot beside a dying man's bed and stayed. Casey never once mentioned the smell. I want you to understand that clearly. She was in that room every single day, closer to it than Bradley had ever been for his 11 minutes. And not once, not one single time in 4 months, did I see anything in her face that told me she found any part of caring for me distasteful. She'd sit with me in the mornings while the home health nurse changed my dressings, hold my hand through the parts that hurt, and afterward she'd open the windows, not because the room disgusted her, but because she said fresh air was good for both of us. The same practical, unfussy kindness she brought to everything. There was a night about 6 weeks into her staying with me, my breathing bad enough that I woke her twice before dawn just to sit with me until it settled, and I remember apologizing to her the second time, telling her she shouldn't have to lose sleep over an old man's bad nights on top of everything else she was already carrying. She just pulled her chair closer to the bed and said, "Dad, this is exactly where I want to be. Stop apologizing for needing help." I need you to understand. Hearing her say that meant more to me than almost anything else in those 4 months, because it told me she wasn't enduring my decline out of obligation. She'd simply decided, somewhere along the way, that this was what love looked like when it actually mattered, and she wasn't going to flinch from any part of it. Casey kept working her regular shifts at the salon too, exhausted some evenings in a way I could see settling into her shoulders the moment she walked through the door, still coming straight to check on me before she even took her coat off. I asked her once, gently, whether her boss understood what she was managing at home, whether she was getting any real support at work for everything she was carrying. She told me her boss knew mostly, and mostly didn't ask too many questions, which she said suited her fine, because she didn't especially want to talk about it at work either. "I don't need people feeling sorry for me, Dad," she said. "I need to just get through each day, and then get through the next one." I want to tell you something about Casey that I didn't fully understand myself until that spring. Something that helped me see why she'd become the kind of person who could sit beside a dying man's bed for 4 months without once looking for the door. 6 years earlier, Casey had been engaged to a man named Trevor, a decent enough fellow by most accounts, and the engagement had ended, quietly, painfully, right around the time Joanne's health first started declining, in the months before the cancer diagnosis that eventually took her. Casey had started coming around more during that stretch, staying later, helping her mother through appointments and difficult days, and Trevor had grown frustrated, in the particular way people sometimes grow frustrated when someone else's family obligations start interrupting the life they'd planned together. I remember him saying, once within my hearing, that Casey needed to figure out where her priorities actually belonged. She figured it out. She just didn't figure it out the way he wanted her to. I never fully understood, until Casey told me herself one evening on that folding cot, just how much that breakup had cost her, not just the relationship itself, but the quiet, ongoing doubt it planted in her, whether the kind of devotion she offered so easily to family was something that made her lesser somehow, less desirable, less serious about her own life. Exactly the kind of thing Denise's comments over the years had always implied without ever quite saying. "Dad," she told me that evening, "I used to wonder if Trevor was right, if I really was just choosing everyone else over myself. But sitting here with you these past few months, I don't wonder anymore. I know exactly what I'd choose every single time, and it's this." I sat with that a long while after she said it, thinking about a son who'd built an entire life around never once having to sit in an uncomfortable room, and a daughter who'd apparently decided, somewhere in the wreckage of a broken engagement, that showing up for the people she loved was worth more to her than almost anything else a life could offer instead. There was another evening, closer to the 2-month mark, when Bradley's wife Denise called Casey directly, not me, to ask, in a tone Casey later described as more curious than concerned, whether Casey thought this whole arrangement was really sustainable long-term, whether it might make more sense, practically speaking, to look into a proper facility instead. Casey didn't repeat the whole conversation to me until much later, protecting me, I think, from one more small cruelty layered on top of everything else that spring. When she finally did tell me, her voice stayed level, but I could see, even then, exactly how much that call had cost her to hear. I remember thinking, watching my daughter those months, that there's a particular kind of strength that never once announces itself, that simply keeps showing up, day after day, without asking anybody to notice how hard it actually is. Casey had that strength in a way I don't think anybody else in this family had ever fully recognized, mostly because she'd never once tried to make sure they did. Welcome back to Brian's Revenge if you're just joining us, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this one, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because everything I've told you so far was just the setup for something Casey found in my own attic, something that changed the rest of this story in ways neither of us could have predicted. My condition worsened in the 2nd month, badly enough that Dr. Anand recommended a specialized cardiac procedure, an implanted device that could ease the strain on my failing heart, and if it worked the way he hoped, buy me meaningful additional time, maybe years rather than months. The procedure itself was covered by my insurance mostly, but the specialized cardiac team Dr. Anand wanted, the one with the most experience implanting this particular device in patients my age and condition, required a deposit of $4,600 that my coverage gap wouldn't touch. I called Bradley first, the way you call the child who's got more, hoping some old, worn-down piece of me still believed a father's declining health might matter more to him than 11 minutes worth of discomfort had suggested. "Dad," he said, after I'd explained it, his voice carrying a particular strain I recognized from every conversation we'd had since the diagnosis, "are you sure this procedure is really worth it at this stage? I don't mean that unkindly, I just mean, realistically, how much difference is it actually going to make? It's the difference between years and months, Bradley." Dr. Annan was fairly clear about that. There was a pause, long enough that for one foolish second I let myself. Then quieter, flatter. "Dad, I've got the kids' tuition payments this semester, and honestly I don't know that I feel right about spending significant money on a procedure that might not even meaningfully extend things. Have you talked to Casey about it? I know she doesn't have much, but maybe between the two of us." I hung up before he finished that sentence. "I want you to understand why. It wasn't the money, not really. It was hearing my own son do math out loud about how many additional months of my life were actually worth funding. I called Casey that same evening, ashamed in the particular way you get ashamed asking your daughter, the one everybody in this family has quietly decided isn't quite as capable, for something her more comfortable brother had just hedged on. "Dad, stop," she said, before I'd gotten more than a sentence out. "How much and by when?" "Casey, I can't ask you to, you're not." I heard her already moving around her apartment, drawers opening. "I've got some savings and I can pick up extra clients this month. Give me till Friday. Casey, that's your savings. You've been putting that toward a deposit on a house of your own. The house can wait, Dad." She said it like it was the simplest math in the world. "It's not going anywhere. Neither are you if I've got anything to say about it. If you're still with me, that tells me something about you." Subscribe if you haven't already, because more stories like this one come out every week. Hit that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Casey found 3 weeks after that procedure is the reason this story doesn't end the way either of my children expected it to. Casey didn't just come up with the $4,600. She picked up extra clients at the salon for 3 straight weeks, working Sundays she used to keep free, and dipped into savings she'd been building for almost 4 years toward a down payment on her own place, the first thing she'd ever truly saved for entirely on her own. She never once told me the full extent of what she'd given up until months later, when I found her bank statements while helping her with something else entirely and did the math myself. She emptied a 4-year savings account so her father could have a chance at additional years, and never once made it sound like anything other than an obvious thing to do. The procedure went well, better than even Dr. Annan had hoped, and while I was recovering, Casey decided the house needed a proper cleaning, top to bottom, the kind of cleaning I hadn't managed myself in longer than I wanted to admit. She started in the attic on a Saturday afternoon while I dozed downstairs, and she came down 2 hours later carrying a battered cardboard box I hadn't opened in probably 30 years, dust thick enough on the lid that she'd had to wipe it away just to read what I'd scrawled across the top in Sharpie decades ago. "Session tapes, 7481. Dad," she said, setting it carefully on my lap. "What is all this?" "Old work," I told her, running my hand over reels of 1/4-inch tape, notebooks full of chord charts and half-finished lyrics, a stack of contracts I hadn't looked at since before she was born. Things I played on, things I wrote, back before any of this. I completely forgot most of it existed. There was one notebook in particular, near the bottom of that box, full of a song I'd written back in 1978. Something I'd worked on for months and never quite finished to my own satisfaction, called 6 Miles from Anywhere. I remembered pitching it to a publisher who'd shown some interest, remembered signing a contract that gave the publishing company partial rights in exchange for an advance that had helped cover Bradley's first year of diapers, and then remembered, or rather failed to remember, whatever had happened to that song after that. One of 100 small disappointments from a career that mostly hadn't panned out the way I'd hoped when I was younger. Casey sat with me that whole afternoon while I told her stories about those years, the studios, the musicians I'd worked with, some of whom had gone on to real fame while I'd ended up managing hardware inventory. She asked good questions, the kind that told me she was actually picturing it, wanted to know what the studio smelled like, whether I'd been nervous the first time I played on a real record, whether I ever regretted setting it all aside for a steadier paycheck. I answered as honestly as I could manage, told her there were nights, even now, when I missed it in a way that felt almost physical, and other nights when I understood completely that raising her and her brother in this house had been worth every bit of what I'd given up to make it possible. Near the end of that afternoon, almost as an afterthought, she asked whether I'd ever tried looking up what had happened to any of those old songs, whether they were still out there somewhere. I hadn't. I want you to understand that clearly, because it matters for what comes next. I'd assumed, The way you assume about most things from a career that didn't quite work out, that 6 miles from anywhere had simply disappeared into whatever void takes unsuccessful songs, forgotten by everybody except an old man with a box in his attic. That's not what had happened. I want to sit with the contrast there, because it matters for everything that comes after. My son stood in a doorway with his coat on, timing his own visit against a dinner reservation. My daughter set up a cot beside a dying man's bed and stayed. There was something else in that attic box, tucked beneath the tapes and contracts, that I hadn't expected to find, and that Casey nearly missed entirely. A small envelope sealed, my name written across the front in Joanne's handwriting, dated 11 years before she died. I don't know why she never gave it to me while she was alive, or why she tucked it away in a box she knew I'd eventually open, if not soon then someday, once I finally got around to it. Casey found it on a different afternoon than the tapes, weeks into her stay, and brought it to me without opening it herself, said some things belonged to me alone to read first. I opened it that evening, Casey sitting quietly beside the bed while I read, and I want to tell you what it said, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. Joanne had written it during a stretch I remembered as a hard one, a year when the hardware distributor job felt like it was slowly grinding something out of me, when I'd come home some evenings too tired and too discouraged to be much of a husband or a father, let alone the musician I used to. She wrote that she'd watched me set aside a real gift for the sake of raising our children, and that she never once wanted me to think that sacrifice had gone unnoticed, or that the music was gone forever just because I'd stopped chasing it professionally. Someday, she wrote, something you made is going to find its way back to you, Arthur. I don't know when, and I don't know how, but talent like yours doesn't just disappear because the world stopped paying attention to it for a while. Save this letter for a day you need reminding of that. I sat there with that letter in my hands, Casey's hand finding mine without either of us saying much of anything, and I thought about how strange it was, that of everyone in my life. It was Joanne, gone 6 years now, who'd somehow known this day was coming before either of us had any earthly reason to believe it. If this story's got you leaning forward, that's exactly where you should be, because what Casey found over the following 2 weeks changed everything about what I understood my own forgotten work might still be worth. Casey spent an evening online, patient in the way she is about most things, searching the title, my name, anything she could think to try, and what she found, eventually, buried in a music industry trade publication from 18 months earlier, stopped her cold enough that she came into my bedroom at nearly 11 at night, laptop in hand, to show me directly. I remember her sitting on the edge of my bed, scrolling slowly, reading parts of the article out loud in a voice that kept catching on itself, like she wasn't fully trusting what she was reading even as she read it. She'd pause, reread a sentence, look up at me, then back down at the screen, building towards something I could see she wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet. 6 miles from anywhere, it turned out, had been quietly sampled 2 years earlier by a major recording artist, a young singer whose name meant nothing to me, but apparently meant a great deal to most of the world under 40, in a song that had gone on to become one of the most streamed tracks of that entire year. The publishing company that had signed me back in 1978, the one that held partial rights to that old song, had been collecting substantial royalties on that sample for 2 years, and according to the article, had been unable to locate the song's original credited co-writer, listed in decades-old paperwork simply as A. Kessler, to distribute his contractually owed share, which had been sitting in an escrow account accumulating the entire time. I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it, at nearly 11 at night, my daughter's laptop glowing in a bedroom that still smelled faintly of the medical equipment, my own son had once found unbearable. I read the article 3 times before I let myself believe it was actually describing a song I'd written on a legal pad in this very house, 46 years ago, for an advance that had covered diapers. "Dad," Casey said, her voice careful, like she understood the size of what she was holding out to me. "The article says the escrow account is disclosed publicly for shareholder transparency reasons. Dad, it lists an estimated balance. I have to ask you to sit down before I tell you the number, except you're already sitting down, so I don't know what to tell you to do instead. Just tell me, Casey. $2,100,000, Dad." And it's still growing every quarter. The song keeps streaming. I remember sitting there in stunned silence for what felt like a very long time, Casey watching me carefully, ready, I think, to catch me if the shock proved too much for a heart that was already struggling. It wasn't the number itself that undid me, strange as that might sound. It was the sheer improbability of it. The idea that something I'd made in the quietest, most private hours of a life that had mostly gone according to nobody's grand plan had been quietly working on my behalf for 2 full years, waiting patiently in an account I didn't know existed, for a daughter I'd nearly taken for granted to climb a set of attic stairs on an otherwise unremarkable Saturday. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened during those 2 weeks, because I think it matters for the fullness of this story. Once Patricia had confirmed the claim and begun the process of formal identification, the young artist who'd sampled the song, a woman I'll simply call by her stage initials out of respect for her own privacy, reached out through her management team, having apparently learned through the industry grapevine that the original writer had finally been located. She asked through an intermediary whether I'd be willing to speak with her directly, and I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, expecting little more than a polite formality. The call itself surprised me. She'd found the original recording of my song years earlier, digging through old catalog archives looking for something with a particular feel, and she told me, with what sounded like genuine emotion in her voice, that something in the melody had stopped her cold the first time she heard it, that she'd built an entire piece of her own work around trying to capture whatever feeling that old recording had made her feel. "I never knew who wrote it," she told me. "Some of these old catalog credits are a mess, half the names lost to time. I'm glad you're the one behind it. It deserved to belong to somebody real." She asked me, near the end of that call, whether I'd ever written anything else, whether there might be more in that attic box worth a second look. I told her I honestly didn't know, that Casey and I had only made it partway through everything Joanne had kept over the years, and she laughed, warm and genuine, and told me that if I ever wanted help going through the rest of it, professionally, she knew people who'd be glad to listen. I haven't taken her up on that yet. Some days I think I might. Other days I think 6 miles from anywhere finding its way back to me was already more than I ever expected out of a career I'd long since made peace with losing, and that maybe that's enough of a second chapter for one lifetime. I sat with that call a long while after it ended, thinking about a 46-year-old song written alone at a kitchen table after midnight, somehow still capable of reaching across 5 decades to move a stranger enough that she'd built something new. I thought about Joanne's letter, about talent not disappearing just because the world stopped paying attention for a while, and I understood, more fully than I had at any point since Casey first carried that box down from the attic, that some things really do find their way back, exactly the way she'd promised they would. I didn't call Bradley. I want you to remember that, because it matters for what comes later. I never went looking for this money. I'd genuinely forgotten that song existed until my daughter carried a dusty box down from my own attic. I simply stopped assuming, once real evidence existed, that a career I'd long ago written off as a disappointment had actually quietly kept working on my behalf the entire time, waiting for somebody to come looking. I called an entertainment attorney the next morning, a sharp, thorough woman in Omaha named Patricia Nwasu who specialized in exactly this. Patricia, it's Arthur Kessler. I need you to look at something unusual. I co-wrote a song in 1978 that got sampled 2 years ago by a major artist, and apparently there's a substantial royalty balance sitting in escrow that the publishing company hasn't been able to locate me to distribute. She asked me to send over whatever documentation I still had, the original 1978 contract, anything connecting me to the song, and she called back 4 days later, her voice carrying the particular energy of someone who doesn't often get to deliver news this good. Arthur, this is remarkably clean, actually. Your original contract clearly establishes you as co-writer with a defined royalty percentage. The publishing company's escrow filing confirms the balance the article described, and given that they've been unable to locate you despite what looks like a fairly minimal search effort on their part, we have very strong grounds to claim the full amount plus continuing royalties going forward, likely without significant dispute, once we establish your identity formally. I sat there in my bedroom a long while after that call, thinking about a duffel bag and a folding cot, about 11 minutes and a coat that never came off, about a daughter who'd emptied 4 years of savings without once asking what it might mean for her own future. Patricia, I want to move on this quietly. I don't want a single soul outside this call knowing until it's resolved, not even your children, especially not my children. I thought about Casey's laptop glowing in the dark, about the particular careful way she told me the number, worried more about how I'd handle the shock than about anything else. Whatever comes from this, I want it structured as a trust. Irrevocable. Sole beneficiary Casey Kessler. Patricia didn't say anything for a second. All of it, Arthur. The full recovery, after my own remaining care costs and your fees, every dollar, yes. She emptied 4 years of savings so I could have a procedure her brother did math out loud about. Sat beside my bed every single night on a folding cot, and never once let me see her flinch at any part of what dying actually looks like up close. Meanwhile, my son stood in my doorway with his coat on and told me my own house smelled like death. So no, I'm not splitting this for the sake of looking fair. Fair already happened on a folding cot beside my bed, and only one of my children was ever part of it. I hear you, Arthur. I'll have this moving within the month. I hung up the phone and sat there a long while, listening to Casey moving around the kitchen down the hall, thinking about a cardboard box that had waited 46 years in an attic for somebody to care enough to open it. They're going to find out eventually, I thought. And when they do, they're not going to ask how the recovery's going. They're going to ask about the money. I found myself, in the days that followed, thinking often about how strange it is that the two most significant discoveries of that entire spring, my failing heart and my forgotten fortune, had both arrived the same season, as though life had decided, after 74 mostly ordinary years, to finally show me all at once both how fragile I actually was and how much I'd still managed to leave behind that mattered. I don't know that I've fully made peace with either discovery. I know that having Casey beside me for both of them made each one bearable in a way I don't think I could have managed alone. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought, because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are, and I think you're going to want to see how Bradley finds out. Because he doesn't find out from me. He finds out the way I always suspected he would, through his own industry connections, tripping over a name he never expected to see attached to a royalty dispute. 5 weeks after that call with Patricia, Bradley called me at 8 in the evening, his voice tight in a way I recognized right away. "Dad, I need you to explain something to me." A colleague at work, her husband's in music publishing, mentioned a royalty dispute making rounds in the industry. Some old session musician's estate finally getting located after years of searching. "Dad," she said the name Kessler. "Is this about you?" So that's how it happened, I thought. Not from me. From an industry conversation 2 degrees removed from anybody who actually cared to check on me directly these past 4 months. I found out about it 5 weeks ago. Brad filed the claim through an attorney 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks and you didn't call me. Your own son. Last time we talked, Bradley, you were doing math out loud about whether my life was worth the cost of a cardiac procedure. So no, calling you wasn't the first thing on my mind. There was a long silence on the line. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across my driveway. Bradley's car, alone. "Dad, we need to talk about this right now," he said, the moment I opened the door, something anxious underneath the composure he usually carried so easily. $2 million, and I'm hearing about it from a coworker. Neither of us has said one word yet about how the recovery's going, I said. Not one word about how I'm actually doing. Straight to the money. That tells me everything I need to know about where your priorities actually sat this whole time. Bradley stood in that doorway a long moment, hands jammed into his coat pockets, and I watched him take in the house behind me, the folding cot still visible through the open bedroom door down the hall, the same house he'd once said smelled like dying, standing there now in the evening light looking like exactly what it was, a home where somebody had actually lived through something hard. $2 million, Dad, he said again, quieter this time, some of the earlier sharpness giving way to something closer to disbelief. That's not a small thing to just handle on your own without telling me. I understand exactly how large it is, Bradley, I said, steady. I understand it a great deal better than you understood what those 4 months actually looked like for me or for your sister. That's not fair, he said. I called to check in. I visited. 11 minutes, I said. That's how long your one visit lasted, Bradley. I watched the clock. And the thing you chose to say in that 11 minutes was that my own house smelled like I was dying in it, which, I'll grant you, was accurate. It just wasn't kind, and it wasn't necessary, and it certainly wasn't the kind of thing a son says to a father he's actually present for. He was quiet for a moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, the particular stillness of a man doing math he badly wanted to come out differently than it was going to. "Dad, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I was uncomfortable. I didn't know how to be in that room." "You didn't know how to be in that room because you never gave yourself the chance to learn," I said, and my voice caught slightly on that sentence, the only moment in the whole conversation where the calm nearly slipped. "Your sister learned. She learned how to sit with hard things because she chose to stay long enough to learn it. You left before you ever had the chance." He put his head down for a moment, and when he looked back up there was something raw in his face I hadn't seen from him in years, not since he was a much younger man standing at his mother's funeral trying to hold himself together in front of relatives he barely knew. "You remember," he said, quiet now, "when I was maybe 9, and you used to play guitar for us before bed sometimes. I used to think that was the coolest thing in the world, having a dad who could do that. I don't know when I stopped thinking that. I don't know when it turned into something I was embarrassed by instead, the old guitar in the closet, the stories about session work nobody else's dad ever talked about. I think I spent a lot of years trying to build a life that looked nothing like that, successful in a way that felt safe and predictable. And I think somewhere along the way that meant building distance from you too, not just from the parts of you I didn't understand, but from all of it. I sat with that for a long moment, because I want you to understand. It was the most honest thing my son had said to me in years, maybe longer than either of us could easily count. I didn't know you felt that way, Bradley, I said, quieter than I'd spoken to him in a long while. I thought the distance was just how you'd become. Successful people get busy. I told myself that for years. I didn't understand you'd actually built the distance on purpose, as something to protect yourself with. He looked up at that, something shifting behind his eyes. Maybe I did, Dad. I don't know. I know that showing up here these past few months felt like showing up to something I didn't know how to be part of anymore. And instead of learning how, I just found reasons to leave quickly instead. Is this about punishing me, he asked. Or is it about the money? It's about neither, I said. It's about an old song I forgot I'd written, sitting in an escrow account for 2 years waiting for somebody to come looking for it. The same way I sat in this house for 4 months waiting to see whether my own son would come looking for me in any way that actually mattered. You're the one who decided how much of yourself you were willing to give either of us, Bradley. I just finally stopped pretending it hadn't already been decided. He sat down slowly in the chair near my kitchen table, some of the fight draining out of his posture entirely, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. "What do you want from me, Dad?" he asked, his voice smaller now than I'd heard it in years. "I don't need anything from you right now," I said. "I need you to understand what's already been decided because it's already done and no amount of explaining is going to undo it. I filed the claim. Patricia's moving forward with it. Whatever comes from it goes into a trust for your sister." Bradley's head came up sharply at that. "All of it. To Casey. Every dollar," I said. "She emptied 4 years of her own savings without me having to ask twice." Bradley sat beside my bed every single night for 4 months and never once let me see her flinch. "You stood in my doorway with your coat on and told me my own house smelled like death. I'm not splitting this evenly for the sake of looking fair. Fair already happened on a folding cot beside my bed, and only one of my children was ever part of it." He sat there a long moment, quiet, staring at a spot on the floor, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost almost all its earlier edge. "I don't know how to fix this, Dad. I don't know if there's anything I can even say right now that would make this better. There isn't, not tonight," I told him honestly. "This isn't the kind of thing that gets repaired in a single conversation in my doorway, no matter how sorry you're feeling sitting there right now. It's going to take a lot longer than it took you to decide 11 minutes was enough." Casey appeared in the hallway behind me then, having clearly heard most of the conversation from the kitchen. And she didn't say anything at first, just came to stand beside me, steady the way she'd been steady through every single one of these last 4 months. Bradley looked at his sister for a long moment, something passing across his face that might have been the beginning of shame, or might only have been the shock of watching $2 million walk out of his reach and into her name in the space of a single conversation. I honestly couldn't tell you which, not that night, and I'm still not entirely sure now. I've thought a great deal, in the weeks since all of this happened, about what it actually means to be present for somebody, really present. The way Casey was present for me on nights when my breathing scared us both, in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a willingness to sit inside somebody else's hardest hour without needing to escape it. I don't think Casey ever once calculated what staying might cost her, the savings, the sleep, the version of her own life she might have been building instead during those 4 months. I think she simply understood, in a way her brother never gave himself the chance to learn, that some kinds of love only reveal themselves fully in a room that smells like decline, sitting close enough to hold somebody's hand through the worst of it. I think about that old song too, more than I expected to at this stage of my life. A piece of work I'd genuinely given up on decades ago, quietly still finding its way into the world without me, waiting in an escrow account for somebody to come looking. There's a kind of lesson in that, I think, about how easily we write off the things we've built and the people we've loved as finished chapters, when sometimes they are only waiting patiently for us to open the box. I think, too, about Joanne's letter, written 11 years before she died, tucked away in a box she trusted would someday find its way back to me at exactly the right moment. I don't know how she knew, or whether she knew anything at all, or whether it was simply a mother's hope written down on a hard day, meant only as comfort rather than prophecy. I've decided it doesn't matter which. Either way, she was right. Either way, something I made found its way back to me, carried down from an attic by the one child who never once stopped believing there might be something worth finding up there. There's a particular kind of grief I've learned these past few months, in realizing how close I came to never knowing any of this, how easily an entire fortune and an entire reconciliation might have stayed buried in that attic forever if Casey hadn't decided, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, that the house needed a proper cleaning. I think about how many families never get the version of this story where the truth actually surfaces in time to matter. How many old songs, old kindnesses, old debts of love stay buried forever simply because nobody ever climbed the stairs to look. I think, too, about how differently this whole spring might have unfolded if Bradley had been the one to climb those stairs instead, if he'd been the one sitting beside my bed asking about old session tapes, instead of standing in my doorway with his coat on. I don't say that to punish him further. I say it because I think it's true, and because I think it's worth any of you watching this sitting with tonight, in your own families, wondering which one of you is currently the one climbing the stairs, and which one is currently the one standing in the doorway with your coat still on. What I know for certain is this: the families who show up for each other at holidays and call themselves close aren't always the ones who actually show up when it counts. Sometimes the person doing the truest showing up is the one everybody else has quietly decided isn't accomplishing much, sitting on a folding cot beside a dying man's bed, refusing, night after night, to let him see her flinch. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Because what I'm about to tell him, standing in my own doorway with a dusty cardboard box that had waited 46 years for somebody to care enough to open it, and a folding cot still set up in my bedroom that had done more for me in 4 months than 11 minutes ever could, that's a conversation that's going to change everything about who actually gets to sit at my bedside going forward, and who simply gets to hear about my life secondhand from a coworker. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, standing in my own doorway, and it does not go the way he drove over here expecting.